Before the Ottomans, the Ottoman Empire came into being in about 1300 in northwestern Anatolia to the east of the Byzantine capital, Constantinople. It was only one of numerous small principalities which had emerged in Anatolia in the last 2 decades of the 13th century on territory which had previously formed part of the Byzantine Empire. The lords of these territories and their followers were Muslim Turks, and their presence in Anatolia indicates not only a change in sovereignty, but also a change in ethnicity and religion. From being primarily Greek and Christian in the 11th century, by 1300 Anatolia had become primarily Turkish and Muslim. The origins of this change lie in the 11th century. In the mid-century, a confederation of Turkish tribes from Transoxania conquered Iran, and in 1055, occupied Baghdad, establishing it as the capital of the Great Seljuk dynasty. The consequence of these events was not simply to establish a new ruler in Baghdad, but also, with the influx of Turks from Central Asia, to alter the ethnic balance of the Middle East. Many of these Turkish incomers were to colonize Anatolia. A convenient date for marking the beginning of this phenomenon is 1071. In this year the Great Seljuk Sultan defeated the Byzantine Emperor at Manzikert in eastern Anatolia. The battle heralded the rapid collapse of Byzantine rule in eastern and central Anatolia, and the establishment in the following decades of the rule of a branch of the Seljuk dynasty. The area of Byzantine sovereignty shrank to the territory in western Anatolia between the Aegean and the Central Plateau. The collapse of Byzantine defenses and the appearance of a Muslim dynasty undoubtedly encouraged the immigration of Turks. So too did geography. It seems that the Turks who had migrated from Transoxania to the Middle East were, in the main, semi-nomadic pastoralists, and Anatolia was well suited to this way of life. The Mediterranean coastlands and the plain of northern Syria provided them with a warm winter climate, while in the summer they and their flocks could follow the retreating snowline to the upland pastures of the Taurus Mountains and the Anatolian Plateau. It was perhaps these factors more than the collapse of Byzantine rule that encouraged the first Turkish immigrants into Anatolia. Many, one may presume, were to abandon pastoralism and settle in villages. 3. The Turks undoubtedly made up an important element in the realms of the Anatolian Seljuks. They did not, however, form a ruling class. The language of government in the 12th and 13th centuries was Persian, and there was clearly a sharp divide between the Persian-speaking elite of the cities and the Turks in the countryside. It was events in the 13th century that were to raise the political status of Turkish speakers in Anatolia. The same events were also to bring about the political fragmentation in Anatolia and the Balkan Peninsula that was to make possible the establishment of the principality that was to become the Ottoman Empire, and also to favor its rapid expansion. The first of these crises affected the Balkan Peninsula rather than Anatolia. In 1204, the army of the Fourth Crusade conquered Constantinople and established a Latin emperor in the city. With the capital in their possession, the leaders of the crusade divided Byzantine territory in Greece and the Aegean archipelago among themselves, forcing the Byzantine government into exile at Nicaea, Iznik, and confining its territories to western Anatolia. During the course of the century, the Byzantine emperor recovered some lands in mainland Greece and the Peloponnesos, but the area still remained a patchwork of small principalities. The most lasting benefit of the crusade came to Venice, which acquired strongholds in the Peloponnesos and islands in the Aegean, the most important of which was Negroponte, Evora, off the eastern coast of the Greek mainland. By the time of the Ottoman invasion of the Balkan Peninsula in the 14th and 15th centuries, the lands to the north had become similarly fragmented. For a while during the 14th century they found political unity under the Serbian Tsar, Stephen Dušan, d. 1355, whose lands comprised Serbia itself, as well as much of Macedonia, Thessaly, Epirus, and Albania. On Stephen's death, however, his successors divided the territory into small principalities. The same thing happened in Bulgaria. On the death of Tsar Alexander in 1371, his lands between the Danube and the Balkan Mountains divided into 3 separate principalities. This fragmentation of the Balkan Peninsula, which had begun with the Fourth Crusade, was something which the Ottoman conquerors were later to exploit. The Fourth Crusade did not, however, upset the equilibrium in Anatolia. The Byzantine emperor retained control of western Anatolia and remained at peace with the Seljuk Sultan to the east. In the mid-13th century, however, the Seljuk Sultanate suffered a catastrophe. In 1243, a Mongol army, part of an invading force, which, by 1258, had conquered Iran, Anatolia and Iraq, defeated a Seljuk army at Kosetigf and reduced the Sultan to the status of vassal. Henceforth, his overlord was the Ilkhan, the Mongol ruler of Iran. The Mongol conquest did not at once affect Byzantine lands in Western Anatolia. It was, however, a factor in the collapse of Byzantine rule in this area. The Mongols were a pastoral people, and needed the grasslands of the newly conquered Seljuk territory not only for their flocks, but especially for the horses that were essential for their military success. It seems very likely, therefore, that competition from the Mongols forced many Turkish pastoralists to seek new lands in the west. They found these in Byzantine Anatolia, where the river valleys lead down from the high plateau to the warmer climate on the shores of the Aegean, a feature of the landscape that was well suited to their summer and winter migration. The Turkish migration to the west became easier after 1261. In this year, the Byzantine Emperor, Michael VIII Palaiologos, reconquered Constantinople. It was, as it turned out, a victory with some unhappy consequences. Once established in Constantinople, the emperor used his resources against enemies in the west, ignoring his apparently secure eastern frontier. As Byzantine fortresses and military organization fell into disrepair, invasion from the east became easier, and there was a Turkish migration, through the crumbled defenses, to the sea. Thus, in the last decade of the 13th century, Western Anatolia experienced the same transformation in its ethnic composition as Central and Eastern Anatolia had experienced in the last decade of the 11th. As in the 11th century, this change in ethnicity from primarily Greek to primarily Turkish had important political consequences. These to a large extent mirror the political changes in the former Seljuk realms. After 1243, the Seljuk sultans lost their power to Mongol governors, their formerly sovereign territory becoming the western outpost of the lands of the Ilkhans of Iran. In 1302, the last Seljuk sultan died. His death coincided with a period of weakening Ilkhanate control over Anatolia, making it possible for local governors, lords and bandits to establish themselves as independent rulers. Thus, in the early 14th century, what had been Seljuk and Ilkhanate Anatolia broke up into a kaleidoscope of principalities. Of these, the largest, the longest-lived and the most fearsome rival of the Ottoman Empire was the Emirate of Karaman in south-central Anatolia, with the old Seljuk capital of Konya as a principal city. The same phenomenon occurred in the former Byzantine lands in Western Anatolia. Byzantine rule did not survive the Turkish immigration of the late 13th century, and by 1300 Turkish rule had replaced Greek, with a series of Turkish principalities on the former territory of the emperor. On the south coast, around Antalya, lay the Principality of Tekke. To the north of Tekke and lying inland were the territories of Hamid, around Isparta, and Germian, with its capital at Kütahya. At the southernmost tip of the Aegean coast lay the Principality of Mentish. To the north of Mentish were Aden and Saruhan, with Tyre and Manisa as their respective capitals. To the north of Saruhan, with part of its shoreline along the Dardanelles, lay the Emirate of Karasi. Northwest of Karasi, in the former Byzantine province of Bithynia, was the Emirate of Osman, the founder of the Ottoman dynasty. His lands were to form the nucleus of the Ottoman Empire. One feature in particular distinguished the principalities that had emerged on former Byzantine and Seljuk territories from the polities, which they had replaced. Now the rulers and their followers, and not simply the subject people, were Turks. They were also Muslims. The mosques which they built during the course of the 14th century bear witness to their faith, while the grandiose titles which they adopted for their mosque inscriptions show their wish to emulate the Seljuk sultans and the rulers in the old Islamic world. Nonetheless, the literary fragments which survive in Turkish from 14th century Anatolia suggest that these new Turkish lords were a rude, unlettered folk, largely ignorant of the tenets of the Orthodox Islam which they outwardly professed. This was the world into which the future Ottoman Empire emerged, strongly Turkish and tentatively Islamic. As the empire expanded, it became increasingly multinational, both in its subject populations and in its body politic. At the same time, the Islam of the rulers, which expressed itself through the adoption of Islamic law and the imposition of formal Islamic ritual, became increasingly orthodox. Nonetheless, the use of Turkish as the language of government and the Turkish element in the population, both a reflection of the empire's origins, gave the state a Turkish character.